Imagine you're looking down on Earth from outer space. It's nighttime down where you're looking. Europe, a large cloud formation, moves over the Alps, while a faint green glow from the northern lights crowns the top of the planet. You sweep your eyes downwards and see that in between long stretches of darkness are intense webs of artificial light. These cities, towns and villages pepper the Earth's surface, home to the majority of our 8 billion people, linked to one another by millions of roads, train tracks, rivers, cables, Wi-Fi connections and trade routes. What intrigues me is just how interconnected we all are, and that underscores the urgency to come up with solutions to stave off climate change, a new banking crisis, further inequality, all-out war. This is the first episode of Season 3 of the podcast we call The We Society. I'm Will Hutton. I'm a writer, a columnist, and the former editor-in-chief of the Observer newspaper. I'm also an economist. I always fought against the notion that human beings are desiccated calculating machines that economists want us to be to make free market economics work. Rather, we are moral beings. The reality is that we have to take a moral view. We are connected, which brings us to the sort of work we're reflecting on in these podcasts. Social science is shaping the world we live, and we'll be offering up imaginative and forward-thinking fixes to the most pressing problems of our time through conversations with the UK's top social scientists. Whether you realise it or not, the social sciences touch all of our lives and determine how we interact with one another. There's thousands of lessons to be learned, and it's my job to lead you into the belly of the social science beast. Welcome to the We Society podcast. Glancing at recent British newspaper headlines, you'd be forgiven for thinking that all the migrants and asylum seekers in the world are crossing the English Channel to get to Kent. Indeed, the Conservative government, announcing their Stop the Boats policy, suggested that as many as 100 million asylum seekers were queuing up, ready to flood Britain. But that's not true. In fact, migration between the countries of the global south accounts for nearly half of all international migration. These days, it feels like the whole world is on the move due to war, earthquakes, famine, climate change, and you wouldn't be completely wrong for believing that. In 1980, 150 million people made the move to migrate. In 2020, that figure had shot up to just over 280 million. Professor Heaven Crawley is one of the world's authorities on mass migration. She leads the Migration for Development and Equality Centre at Coventry University, a global network of partners in 12 countries in the global south, which aims to reduce inequalities and further the cause of economic and social development. Because only by researching and engaging with the countries where mass migrations happen can we be in with a chance of ensuring migrants are protected and inequality lessened. Welcome to the We Society, Professor Crawley.
Thank you.
When we invited you to join the We Society podcast, what were your first thoughts when you heard the word We Society? Did you make sense of it? Were you inquisitive, or did you think, I know exactly what they're on about?
Well, that's an interesting question to start. Did my Googling, had a little bit of a look at what you, the kinds of topics that you talk about. And I gather it's a way of really thinking about how we have connections between us all. You know, regardless of where we live on the planet, we are in some way connected. So that's how I come at this. Fair
enough. That's good. A good definition. Migration. You are one of the world authorities on it. Let's just get a sense of where your interest began in migration.
Well, I went to Sussex University in the late 80s, and I was doing a degree in geography in what was then the African Studies Department, the African Studies School. And I guess I was very young. I didn't really have a clue about these topics. And frankly, migration was not then very much spoken about. It's hard to believe that now, but it certainly was the case then. But during my undergraduate degree at Sussex, I became really interested in migration, in part because it was just starting to be a topic of discussion. And the reason why was because of the breakup of the former Yugoslavia. And so in the kind of context of Europe, suddenly there were quite pressing migration and refugee issues that were starting to make the headlines, a bit like, I guess, now, but on a much lower scale. And so I started doing some research on that. I published a dissertation on that. I went off to do a master's, actually just still at Sussex, but at the Institute for Development Studies in Gender and Migration. And when I was given the opportunity to do a PhD, I decided to sort of bring these issues together to look at the ways in which gender shapes the migration experience, and particularly focusing on the experiences of women, refugee women seeking asylum in Britain. So, yeah, it kind of was incidental and opportunistic, as many of these things in life are. But once I'd kind of got the migration bug, I really haven't lost it, frankly. And here we are 35 years later talking about this topic almost on a daily basis, not just in the UK, but frankly across the whole of the world. Migration has become increasingly politically contentious and a kind of symbol of lots of the other changes that are happening in the world.
Well, that's because there is a sense in the global north, and more acute in some countries than others, but a sense across the global north that actually there are limits to the absorptive capacity of any country for immigrants. And actually there are the numbers of people who are looking to move, partly because of climate change and epidemics and all the rest, and partly because of authoritarian regimes and distressing stories of oppression and torture. And actually, you have to constrain it, and that elected politicians are signalling that, we hear you, electorate, we're going to try and do something, and try and do it as far as they can, stretching international law, but within international law. I mean, that's one way of thinking about why it's risen in salience. Do you agree with that?
No, I don't, actually. And I'll tell you why. I mean, first of all, context is everything, right? If you are being told effectively, spurious tales of numbers and scales of migration that simply aren't in line with what's happening in the world, then of course you're going to be anxious. And therefore, politicians of all colours will sort of latch onto this as a potential way of getting your sympathy and empathy and ultimately your vote. The truth is that 97% of the world's population doesn't move. Far more, people don't go anywhere than do go somewhere. And in fact, historically, migration has always been a driver of development. In the global south, we see that now, but just look at what's happened in the global north. How did the global north come to be what it was in terms of its relative power in the world? And that was largely through migration, through exploration, through colonialism, and all that went with it. So, I think there's a historical context that's important. There's a geographical context that's important, because most people don't move, or if they do move, they move within the countries of the global south. And then there's a sort of, political context, which is understanding that the motivations and the drivers for these migration, these largely anti-migration narratives, are not necessarily rooted in the evidence about what the consequences of migration are, but a series of other kind of objectives, which I think are motivated by other factors. I mean, I've been doing research on this topic for 35 years now. I don't know everything, of course I don't, but I mean, I have a pretty good grasp of what the evidence tells us. And yes, there are, of course, issues associated with migration that are not unproblematic, particularly in terms of, various kinds of social integration. But many of the things that are positive about migration simply don't get spoken about. And the things that are spoken about in a negative way are often a very small part of what's actually going on. And so, yes, there are issues around migration, but it's a very skewed representation of what the evidence tells us. And I think really kind of trying to engage, national governments, but also the UN system and different audiences in these alternative, more nuanced approaches to migration is what's needed, because what we have at the moment isn't really getting us anywhere terribly effectively in terms of the policy.
There's a spectrum, isn't there? There's asylum seekers, and then there's kind of illegal migration, and then there's legal migration. And I would like to think that a government of a different political hue might have taken a less emotional kind of stance to what's called the small boats crisis. But nonetheless, I mean, you do see the political salience of it. I mean, the numbers crossing on small boats across the English Channel into the UK has It's risen every year since 1918 and since 2018 to 45,000. And so, I mean, yeah, it's quite tricky for a government to say we're not going to do anything about this. So they're just going.
I'm not for one moment suggesting that should be the approach. But I mean, I think, I've been working on the issue of migration to the UK for a long time. And I specifically undertook a very large piece of work called the MIDEQ project in 2015-16 around the very significant increase in arrivals of migrants across the Mediterranean, particularly to Italy and to Greece. So, we know why people move and we know the drivers of migration and all that goes with it. Now, what's happened since 2018, it's not an accident. It's not an accident that suddenly the numbers have started to increase crossing the channel to get to the UK. It's a consequence of all sorts of policies that are not necessarily even migration related, or ironically were intended to stop migration. I'm talking here about Brexit, because one of the things that Brexit did, and of course was not spoken about and is still not spoken about, is it removed the UK from the Dublin Convention, essentially, which is about the arrival of third country nationals. Now, that means that you can't, as a government, return people to the country from which they came, in this case, France. Now, one of the things that we know that happens when people are making decisions about why they might go, and we're talking specifically here about asylum seekers, who are, of course, the smallest proportion of migrants altogether, but one of the things that we know is that they are given information by smugglers, by people traffickers, by others, about where they should spend their money in order to get the best opportunity to rebuild their lives, right? Remember that more than 80% of all those who arrive across the channel get refugee status, right? So these are not people who have no reason to seek protection. They're very much looking for an opportunity to rebuild their lives. And the smugglers know the deal. You go to the UK, you can't be returned because the UK has withdrawn from the Dublin Convention. So at what point are we going to have an honest conversation about the broader political processes that have led to this current situation, which is being dealt with in the way that it is? And in short, we're not going to have that conversation because it's much easier, isn't it, to blame other people rather than looking at government policy itself. So, I am under no illusions. The new policies, the new Illegal Migration Act won't make any difference any more than any of the other multiple waves of legislation over the last 20 years have done, because nobody's looking at the root causes. Nobody's looking at establishing safe and legal routes. The only people who can get to the UK legally are the Ukrainians, and even that has become much lower in numbers. So if we're serious about wanting to address this issue, then we have to address the reasons why people move in the first place. In this case, refugees or asylum seekers who are needing protection, most of whom get it when they arrive. I'd like an honest conversation about that rather than this kind of, spurious narrative headlines that don't really engage with any of those broader factors.
What about Hong Kong? I mean, I thought there was a provision to permit some hundreds of thousands of Hong Kong nationals to come to the UK over the next 10 years.
Yeah. And what does that tell you? How big an issue has that been in the media? How much of a public narrative about stopping that has there been? None. Why? Because the government has shown political leadership and, taken the action that was necessary to allow those safe and legal routes to happen. It's not difficult. It's entirely possible to do this in a much more orderly, managed way if you choose to take on board the fact that people need protection, it can be done. It was done with Hong Kong, done with Ukraine, was partially attempted in the case of Afghanistan, although has proven to be completely a disaster because nobody in reality has been able to make use of that route. So, you've just given a very good example of what can be done if there's a political will to do it. And unfortunately, that's the bit that's lacking for all sorts of reasons, not least the fact that this has become a very good distraction from other political problems that the UK is currently facing.
You distinguish in asylum seekers and other forms of migrants. I mean, just spell that out for the average listener.
Sure. I mean, migrants in a way is a catch-all category that includes anybody who moves, right? Anybody who moves for work, for tourism, more than 1 year, so adventure if you like, people who are travelling as students, all sorts of categories are migrants and refugees, right? But if people are moving and under international law, there is no obligation for any country to accept people who are moving for those reasons. The issue is that there is a piece of international law called the Refugee Convention, which obligates states to provide protection for people who claim asylum. So that is people who are fleeing, persecution or unrest of various kinds, which means that they can't be protected. So they're not, it's really problematic, this kind of differentiation along lines of forced and voluntary, because of course, in many cases, and we saw it particularly with the Syrians, for example, who moved to Europe, people move because of reasons of persecution, maybe to Lebanon, maybe to the region, and then, economically they find it impossible to survive. There's discrimination, a lack of rights, and they move on. So these categories are very problematic. But the point is that asylum seekers do have rights under international law to be protected, or at least to be allowed to remain whilst their cases are considered. And if someone's granted protection under international law, they become a kind of convention refugee, if you like. So those are, in broad terms, the differences. But, we have these categories like illegal.
So if you're fleeing from
and
persecution, you can categorise yourself as an asylum seeker.
Well, if you apply for asylum, many countries, especially in the south, don't have asylum procedures, so they become de facto refugees by virtue of being in another country, seeking, living and being protected from something by virtue of being there. But yeah, an asylum seeker is somebody who claims asylum under a process that's been established to do that. And the UK has a process, as do other countries. And so those people are asylum seekers until their claims are determined. And when, in the case of the small boat crossings, those people, 70%, 80% of them are given refugee status, are recognised as being in need of protection, they become convention refugees. And that's what's going on at the moment. That story's not been told, but that's what's happening.
And what about this British government claim that there could be 100 million asylum seekers?
Well, it's just nonsense. Based on what? Based on what information? The vast majority of refugees, upwards of 85%, we have figures from UNHCR, remain in their regions of origin, often in the very next door country. And they do that for a number of different reasons. They don't have the economic resources to do otherwise, frankly, in many cases, but they also don't necessarily want to leave the region. The people who move out of the region are those with, social and economic capital to be able to do something else. And frankly, it's not the vast majority of people. And, many, many other countries, including countries in Europe, have far more refugees and asylum seekers. It's just scaremongering. There is absolutely no evidence to support that assertion. And I really don't know where those figures are coming from.
One of the things your centre does, it's called the Centre for Equality, Migration for Development and Equality Centre. I'm interested why you feel the need to put equality in the title of your centre.
Well, I'll just say a little bit more about the centre. It's a hub rather than a centre, and it's one of 12 hubs, which are very large research projects, funded somewhat ironically, perhaps in the context of this conversation, by the British government, intended to really help us to grapple the global challenges that are facing the world and the UK's position within that. So we have significant UK government funding to be able to really unpack and understand what's going on here. What are the kind of drivers of migration? How are they impacting on development processes? What are the consequences for the individuals concerned? Now, why have we put inequality in the mix? Well, frankly, migration doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens as a consequence of various inequalities in the world, income inequalities, wealth inequalities, inequalities in opportunity, inequalities in the right to be protected from your government, that motivate people in different ways. And that migration also can either contribute to inequality or it can reduce it. So it can create resources that are then sent back to countries of origin that, provide remittances to enable children to go to school, that give women the opportunity to, do something with their lives because they have resources. Or it can increase inequality because, people can't safely and legally migrate, and they often end up being exploited, don't have access to rights and opportunities. So to me, I don't see how we can talk about migration without talking about inequality, because it's not, in some ways, migration is a consequence of these things, not just, it's not the driver, it's the outcome. So that's what the centre does. And we do that in a very particular way, which is by harnessing the existing expertise and knowledge of academic scholars and organisations in the global south. Because let's face it, most of these narratives that we've been talking about are dominated by the global north, particularly Europe and North America. And they are, embedded in a whole set of historical and geographical factors, which we've just been discussing. And actually, understanding migration, which mostly, as we've said, takes place in the Global South, means you have to engage with what we know about migration in the Global South, with the people who speak the language, know the context, and can engage much more proactively in local and national context. So that's what the centre does. And that's why, it's one of those things that once you've seen it, you can't unsee it. Once you've seen how migration is affected by inequality and vice versa, you can't go back and just look at migration in the abstract.
Is that why the number has jumped from 150 million in 1980 to over 280 million today in just 40 years?
You know
you would
why?
say that
You know why? It's because the population of the world has increased, and proportionately it's exactly the same as it always was, between 3.5 and 3.7%. So no, it isn't why at all. That said, of course, there are processes happening in terms of globalization, in terms of technological change. All of those things have, of course, contributed to the kinds of migration and where migration takes place. But the proportions are really a product of population growth, global population growth. That's what we're seeing.
I just want to pause the conversation here to tell you more about the We Society podcast, brought to you by the Academy of Social Sciences. Professor Heaven Crawley has provided us with a fascinating insight into how a key driver of migration is inequality in the Global South. And inequality is a thread that runs through the work of numerous other social scientists, including Professor Kate Pickett, the author of The Spirit Level, who we interviewed in Season 1 of the We Society podcast. She goes into detail as to why inequality hurts us all, not just the poor. We've covered a multitude of other important themes in our previous seasons, from race issues, the NHS, climate change. The list goes on. And not to forget leading public figures like the Chinese dissident Ai Weiwei or Hillary Clinton. So, do check out our previous seasons on your favourite podcast platform and listen to the best ideas that shape the way we live. I'm just imagining you advising a government minister about the small boats crisis. I mean, he or she, in fact, the Home Office, it's been Theresa May and Suella Braverman have both been she's. They're both Home Secretaries. And there they are, with these kind of images of small boats landing, clips of interviewees in places like Dover saying, we can't take this flow, we've got to do something. And then you've left the European Union, so you haven't got that card to play that we used to have, of actually under the Dublin Agreement, being able to send them back to within the European Union where they first landed. How does one manage this politically? What would you say? Could you constrain the numbers coming across the channel in that way?
Well, were I to be in that situation, I would have to probably gloat for a few moments, because 20 years ago, when I worked at the Home Office and was advising the government on exactly these issues in relation to the Songac crisis, for example, we were saying exactly the same thing. Listen to the evidence, look at the motivations, look at setting up safe and legal routes. My advice would be very similar to what it was then, which is that if you want to tackle these issues, first of all, let's be honest, we have a sort of a coming together of different events here that are not easily undone. I don't underestimate the impact of the withdrawal from the Dublin Agreement. I think it's made a huge impact, not just directly in terms of the ability to remove, because in fact, not that many people were necessarily removed, but in terms of what it's done to the narratives and the kind of business model, if you like, of the smugglers and the people traffickers. And I think we also have to remember that people are dying in this process. This is not necessarily being talked about. People are drowning, as they did in the Mediterranean, in 2015, 2016. People are drowning in the Channel, regularly. So this is not.
So when Rishi Sunak and Suella Braverman stand up and say, it can't be right that gangs of people traffickers are calibrating and determining the numbers, crossing the Channel and coming to Britain, we have to be, the elected government of the day, have to be the people who decide on that. It's a very, very potent thing to say in any democracy, but if you wanted to amend their position or criticise their position constructively, what would it be? What could you say to them? Or how could you, people listening to it thinking, they're right, how would you change their mind?
First of all, I would tell them what the evidence says, which whatever happens in terms of the the policy of sort of deterrence and, removing the right to return to the UK and whatever else is, that information is never going to get to the migrants themselves, right? They are being sold a kind of an idea about what's possible in the UK, how they might get there. They're not going to be told the nuances of what the consequences might be in reality. And often the things that motivate people, including, as I say, more than 70% of people coming from context of violence and conflict, they're not going to care, frankly. They will take their risk with everybody else, even if that involves them and their children being, potentially drowning in the Channel. So, I would just, first of all, just abandon this idea that deterrence works any more than it worked with Songat, any more than it worked with any of the other things that have been tried for the last 20 years. There's only two things that will work. One is meaningful conversations.
So you said Songat. What was that you said? I didn't quite catch it.
The Songat crisis. There's been multiple events.
You mean the camps in Calais?
Yeah, but going back to Songat in the early 2000s, when there were conversations happening between Blair and President Sarkozy, if I remember then. So, this rhetoric of deterrence has been going back a long way. There are only two things that will work, neither of which, it seems to me, are on the table. Number one, and I have to say on the first one, we've lost a little bit of the power of negotiation here, but conversations with the French. I mean, this is a bilateral negotiation around what's happening, surely. Just simply putting up a barrier or changing the policy in the UK isn't going to stop people getting in a boat in France. There's no logic to that whatsoever. It's got to be about why are those people not feeling as if they have a possibility of safety and protection in France? And if they have a kind of right to be in the UK in terms of, for example, family reunion, they are children of adults in the UK or they have relatives, then there should be a way of processing those people in France so that they have speedy access to the right to be in the UK with those family members. That's, you would take out a very significant proportion of numbers straight away. And secondly, you need safe and legal routes. I mean, I know it's become a kind of catch-all for, all sorts of different things, but there is no point in saying you can only apply for asylum if you get to the UK legally. There is no way to get to the UK legally if you need protection. So how are these people supposed to navigate this system when there is no legal entry route? It's not, I'm not speaking out of turn here. There is no legal entry route. So you can't say...
But if Keir Starmer and Yvette Cooper were to say that...
Well, they should be saying that.
The balloon would go up. They would say, "Oh, you just want to create safe and legal routes open door policy." That's what.
Well,
that's
a bit like
saying.
safe and legal routes for the Ukrainians or the Hong Kong citizens that we've just been talking about. It is possible. It is doable, and you can do it in a part of public anxiety, and you said so yourself, public anxiety around this issue is partly because of the lack of control, right? The perceived lack, not just of control over this particular issue, but in general, it undermines the credibility of a government not be able to do something about this, right? Governments can do something about this, and they choose to do something about this when they want to. So that's my point, really. It's not that necessarily the problem is going to go away. I'm not saying that instantly there would be a solution with the French or that the drivers of migration from Eritrea or Afghanistan or Sudan are going to disappear overnight. No, of course not. But we can manage this much better than we are. And I think the political narrative around it has become so toxic that it's kind of closed down the political space to do anything differently. And I'm talking about all parties in this particular regard. There's no political bravery because this has become such a toxic issue, but it has become such a toxic issue because it's been so badly managed. And I mean politically as well as practically.
I'm inferring from this that you're not going to be a cheerleader for the scheme on Rwanda.
Well, no, I have written about the scheme in Rwanda and I'm not a cheerleader. And I'm not a cheerleader because I've spent time in Rwanda. I've worked with the Congolese communities in 2 camps in the north and on the border with Burundi in the south. And I know that refugees in Rwanda are living in pretty abject poverty and they have very few opportunities to improve their lives, and they've been there for several decades. So the idea that you would send people... I mean, we're back to this idea of deterrence effect, right? This is not a sustainable policy option. It's about deterrence. But the idea that you would send people to a country where they have no associations, one of the smallest countries in Africa, where they have no linguistic relationship or capability, where they have no family. Why would you do that?
It's smaller than Wales, isn't it? It's of that size.
I think it's even smaller, to be honest. Anyway, my point is this. It's not a sustainable policy solution, right? But it is intended to, again, send a message to would-be asylum seekers. Don't bother coming to the UK because this is the risk, right? And it clearly, I work with refugees and asylum seekers. I know that people are anxious about this. But it's not, how does that solve the problem of boat crossings? It simply doesn't get to the fundamental drivers, the big inequalities in the world or the inequalities in access to protection elsewhere. It doesn't get to the heart of how do you have a system that works. It's simply a way of getting rid of what might in the end be a few hundred people with the aim of showing that we're not prepared to tolerate this. But I don't think that's it's not a serious way of doing policy, and it's not going to be a long-term solution.
Now, Heaven, it's just a couple of last questions because we're getting near our moment where we have to kind of draw a line under this. But social science, this is the Academy of Social Sciences podcast. I'm the president of the Academy. You're a social scientist. What can social science bring to bear on this? Would you say that you have been speaking for the last kind of 30 or 40 minutes as a social scientist?
A social scientist, but also, a kind of an academic who wants to be politically engaged. I want to produce knowledge that is, first of all, rooted in the reality of what's going on, and that means engaging and working with Global South scholars who typically haven't had the opportunity to bring that knowledge to bear on some of these discussions. But it also means really engaging with and understanding where you can how the political debate and also the policy environment is or isn't shaped by evidence, and how it could be improved in some way by the addition of evidence to the discussions that are happening. I think many policymakers, certainly within the UN where I work, are really interested to find better ways of doing things. We're not, frankly, doing a great job as a human race at the moment. I mean, things are not looking good on many fronts. And I think there is a sort of, a sense that potentially we could do things differently, and we should do things differently for lots of different reasons. If you want to do things differently, then we have to engage with social science, because social science tells us things. I mean, hard science does too, but social science ultimately tells us about human beings, how they relate to one another, how the kind of different systems interact. So I think I have to, after 35 years of sometimes feeling like I'm banging a head against a wall, I have to feel optimistic that social science has the potential to give us new insights and ways of doing things, because I think at the moment we need them.
The people who will have listened to this, they'll be thinking, well, I'm with Professor Crawley. How are we going to make a better argument about not being fearful about migration? Is the argument to everyone have ID cards so we know who's here and who's leaving and who's stayed? Is the argument about having some kind of arbitrary figure, but nonetheless a comforting one, that say only 100,000 people a year are going to come to the UK, and we can absorb that and we should absorb that, and that's our moral obligation to do it? As we finish this podcast, I mean, how would you reassure listeners to this and actually the wider public that, to go with the flow, to actually be more positive about migration?
Yeah, I mean, the two things you just mentioned have been tried. When a couple of years ago, I mean, there's been regular attempts to put a number on the number of people coming. I don't think it's about that. I think it's about two things. One is it's about political leadership and honesty about what's going on. And I don't just mean in relation to migration, I mean more generally, but we know that migration has become a very particular vehicle, let's say, for all sorts of political discussions. Ironically, the problems we're seeing in the Channel now are largely a result of withdrawal from Brexit, which of course was premised on the idea of getting hold of our borders and somehow being more in control of things. So, these narratives are ultimately not serving any good political end. So I think political leadership is really important. But I also think that what we're seeing in terms of community mobilization around some of these issues is really important. Political change doesn't happen by virtue of, somebody just suddenly waking up and wanting to do something differently. What happens is that as people have contact with and engagement with migrants as human beings in their communities, in their societies, often in a very positive way, that they start to understand and connect to these issues in a different way. It's not an easy thing to do, and it takes time. And I have to say, at the moment, it doesn't feel like time is on our side. But I also remind myself that we've been having these conversations for 30 years, and there still is time to do things differently, both in terms of mobilizing on the ground, but also in terms of trying to shift the political narratives from above. I often feel, and it sometimes feels very naive, that somebody at some point will realise that these things aren't working, and that, just try something else. It can't be any worse than what we've already got. And that requires political ambition and bravery, I guess. And it requires people to see things in a different way. So I don't have a simple answer to this. I think it's a complicated problem. I think it's a long-term problem. And it therefore can't be solved easily. But I do have some solutions practically. And I think if we could mobilise ourselves around those ideas and present something as an alternative.
The heart of your solution is to have safe and legal routes, isn't it? I mean, that's the heart of it.
The heart of it is, firstly, acknowledging that migration has happened, is happening for all sorts of reasons that are very legitimate and beneficial in many cases. And secondly, how do we then harness that for development, for the benefit of communities? It's about harnessing the potential of migration. And safe and legal routes is certainly one way to do that. It's not the only way, but in the context of the UK, it's certainly clearly something that needs to happen urgently. But it's about harnessing the potential. It's about harnessing human potential, because ultimately the people who move are the people who have that potential in buckets. That's why they're moving in the first place, right? So it's about harnessing potential, seeing the potential and harnessing it. And I think that's not just about economics. It's about other factors too. Our culture, our language, our societies currently are a product of that. And we can see it around us all the time. So, it's about harnessing the potential of migration for the greater good in some way.
Well, you've said it, Professor Heaven Crawley. Thank you so much for your time speaking to us from New York. I mean, we've covered a bit of ground here. We've discussed how effective sending people to Rwanda might be. We've talked about the drivers of migration. We've come up with a distinction between asylum seekers and migration. You've made a number of really telling points, in particular that Britain leaving the European Union and the Dublin Agreement has been the proximate cause of the small boats crisis, because that meant that as a non-member of the European Union, we no longer had the right to send migrants back to the country where they first landed through whom they transitioned. And you've made a powerful case, above all, for the fact that migration handled the right way can be a powerful force for good, both in the countries to whom the migrants go to, and actually in terms of remittances and all the other ways for the countries from which they've come. And that actually thinking of migration as a force for good would be a hell of a paradigm shift. But thank you so much for your time. You've made me think very hard about these issues, and I'm sure all our listeners. Thank you, Professor Crawley.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much for joining in the conversation. The We Society is brought to you by the Academy of Social Sciences, acss.org.uk. I'm Will Hutton, the producer is Emily Finch, and it's a Whistledown production. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the podcast, leave a comment, share with your colleagues and friends, or send us an email and tell us what we should be asking and who we should talk to.